there, Bourbon Real Talk Plus Patreon members. Randy Selvin here for a very special piece of bonus content. So I got to hang out with some of you over the weekend. Lindsay and I took a trip to Nashville, Tennessee, mostly to see a musical artist that she's a big fan of. He was part of a reunion from a TV show he used to be on, and we drove up there. We stayed with a friend of ours in her wonderful condo and had a good time. Didn't do too much whiskey stuff, but Bourbon Heads, which if you guys watch the podcast, you've probably seen my interview of Dwayne Poore that's got the multi-million-dollar whiskey collection in Oklahoma City. And he ended up starting a whiskey group that's a paid-for group that's mostly administered through a Discord channel. And it's called Bourbon Heads, and it's a $2,500 buy-in. Access is controlled through a, let's see, what are those things called? They're not a cryptocurrency, but the token that's associated with sometimes they use them for art and whatnot. I forget what the name is. But anyways, people got pretty upset whenever I did the interview of Dwayne and his business partner to figure out what they were offering in Bourbon Heads. But they do these events throughout the country multiple times per year, and many of you were Bourbon Heads, and so I got to hang out with some of you, and I was grateful for that, and we had a really good time. But the event that I was able to break away from all of Lindsay's shenanigans and go to that was a whiskey event for Bourbon Heads was at Southern Collective, which is a non-distiller producer distillery that's right around the corner from Frugal McDougal's. So if you've ever gone to Nashville, you maybe have stopped into Frugal McDougal's. They have a lot of really awesome single barrels, so it's a fun place to stop into. The odds of you going in there and getting a bottle of Blanton's or something even more rare than that are pretty low because that store is picked over. But they do have great single barrels and knowledgeable staff, so it's a fun place to go, plus a wide selection. And just around the corner is Southern Collective. And so anyway, we went in there, and the Bourbon Heads were doing a blending competition. They had selected a single barrel. There was a tornado while we were there, and they jokingly picked a second barrel they're calling Tornado Survivor. And I had an amazing time. The distillery was great. They have a library, which I don't know if you guys know this, but pretty much every distillery has a library of all other competitors' bottles that they keep on hand. And they use it for reference. They, while they're blending or whatever, they can go in and taste and see things. But it also makes it fun when you're a guest at the distillery. Sometimes they'll let you go into the library. And they did, and they had some really cool bottles in there. And they had a really awesome distillery dog that was some sort of a mastiff. He was enormous and a very, very sweet boy, and very happy that everybody was there to give him pets. But what I wanted to talk with you guys about was a phenomenon that I've come across a couple of times in the whiskey world. And that is that a lot of people who are thinking about maybe one day starting a distillery go ahead and buy a still and operate illegally for a number of years before they actually get licensed. And in some instances, those individuals are actually filling up barrels and starting to age product. But what they find out after they get their license is that even if they have barrels that are years old and have years worth of aging, they cannot advertise them as such because they didn't have a distilled spirits plant license at the time that the whiskey was barreled. And that has created a unique opportunity for the Southern Collective because they've come across another distillery that was in just such a situation. And apparently, the individual that started this distillery, and I have the brand unallocated, and we sometimes talk with small distilleries who have excess barrels for sale. And we've actually come across this distillery before, and they had some really interesting rye whiskey that we thought about buying. And we still haven't decided whether or not we're going to buy it. But Southern Collective had several other expressions from this distillery. And the story goes that he had distilled this whiskey about 10 years before he ever got licensed. And so he had the whiskey aging in a new charred oak barrel, and then he transferred it into a second new charred oak barrel that I don't think was toasted. And then eventually he transferred it into a multiple use barrel that had pretty much been spent. and allowed it to rest in that barrel where it would have time for esterification and other development of flavor compounds without extracting additional flavors out of the wood, because it already had plenty of wood flavor from being double barreled previously. But the whiskey that we were tasting was 17 years old, but it could only be advertised as 6 or 7 year old whiskey because the person who sold the barrels has only been licensed for 7 years. And so that creates an interesting phenomenon, right? Because it tastes like a very mature 17-year-old whiskey. It didn't have a bunch of barrel char flavor. It still had a lot of fruity congeners. It was very sweet up front. And then on the back end, it had this really nice medicinal cherry, like cherry cough syrup flavor that's very reminiscent of E.H. Taylor Small Batch. But on the front end, it tasted more like a Weller product with all of that like creamy brown sugar and whatnot. It was delicious. And Bourbon Heads picked a barrel of this whiskey. And so from a functional standpoint, if you are looking at purchasing barrels and you want to stay below $12 per year of age, which we've kind of established that even after inflation, that's kind of the consumer limit of how much consumers are willing to pay. And so if you've got a 6-year-old bourbon, consumers might be willing to pay in the, $70, $75 range, something like that. But if you got a 6-year bourbon that you want to sell for $120, people are like, hey, pump the brakes. This is crazy. We're not doing this, right? And from a production standpoint, when you're buying barrels with the cost of bottles and corks and tamper seals and front label and back label and the box for shipping and the labor and all of that stuff, when you calculate all of that, you can afford to pay around $460 per year of age when you buy your barrel, and you should be able to land on shelves on average for about $12 per year. But what do you do when somebody has a 17-year-old barrel that can only be marketed and sold as a 7-year barrel? And so I just thought that was very interesting. Obviously, because the barrels were produced technically illegally and he can't count all the age, they're not worth as much as they would be if he could sell them as 17-year-old barrels. They'd be worth a lot more money, but it creates kind of an opportunity. So we are currently in talks with Southern Collective, and you guys, Bourbon Roll Talk Plus, may be invited out to do a distillery takeover and potentially pick one of these 17-year-old barrels and have it distributed through a online shipping retailer that they have in Tennessee that will ship to pretty much any state. So we are talking with them. Hopefully we'll have some more information by next week. But I just thought that was a fascinating thing for you to consider as a consumer. Sometimes you may be buying a whiskey that has an age statement on it, but it might be a lot older because the regulations did not allow them to put the true age of the whiskey on there, even though that's how the whiskey really was. So I hope that was entertaining for you. Be able to look out for more opportunities. We should be announcing our distillery takeover for Watershed in Ohio sometime in the next couple of days. That looks like it's going to be in mid to late February. And then next week, we'll be making some decisions about whether or not we're going to go out to the Southern Collective. So as always, I love you guys. We couldn't do this without you. I appreciate the support. I love you. And if you have any questions, throw them in the comments below. Talk to you soon.